Something is breaking behind the language of climate diplomacy. And the people trying hardest to stop you from noticing are the same people who understand exactly how dangerous this moment really is. Stay with me to the end, because what looks like a small UN dispute is actually a fight over power, money, and who gets to escape responsibility when the damage becomes impossible to hide. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work, because these stories demand clear eyes, honest analysis, and the courage to follow the truth all the way through. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. There are rare moments in international politics when the smallest country in the room becomes the one telling the biggest truth. This is one of those moments. Vanuatu, a small Pacific island nation with limited hard power, limited market weight, and no ability to coerce anyone, has stepped directly into a confrontation with the Trump administration over climate law at the United Nations. That alone should stop people in their tracks. When Washington pushes this hard against a country like Vanuatu, it is not because the issue is symbolic. It is because the issue is structurally dangerous. Let's be clear about what is happening. Vanuatu is not asking the world for pity. It is not staging moral theater. It is trying to move climate destruction out of the language of vague concern and into the language of obligation. That is the line powerful states fear most. Because once climate harm is framed not as a regrettable side effect, but as something tied to duty, liability, and legal consequence, the whole architecture of global economic privilege begins to shake. This is where the story becomes bigger than climate. For decades, the global system has allowed major emitters to enjoy the benefits of industrial expansion while pushing the deepest costs outward. Those costs were pushed onto weaker nations, onto exposed coastlines, onto fragile public budgets, and onto future generations who never consented to any of it. That arrangement has survived because power protected it. Wealth defended it. Law moved too slowly to challenge it. Vanuatu is now trying to force that law to catch up. And this is precisely why the Trump administration moved against the resolution. Not because one UN text can instantly transform the world, but because political systems built on fossil fuel leverage understand how change really happens. First comes the principle. Then the diplomatic recognition. Then the legal argument. Then the institutional memory. Then, years later, the bill arrives. Trump's opposition is not simply about policy disagreement. It is about preventing the first brick from being laid in a wall that could someday limit American industrial freedom and expose the financial logic behind climate impunity. That is why this moment matters. A country that many Americans rarely think about has become a frontline test of whether the international system can still name reality when reality threatens powerful interests. Vanuatu represents something larger than itself, the part of the world that no longer has the luxury of pretending delay is neutral. For nations living closer to the edge, climate change is not a talking point. It is a survival calculation. And here is the deeper warning for the United States. What is hitting Vanuatu first will not stay in Vanuatu. The costs travel. Through insurance. Through energy systems. Through food, infrastructure, migration, and public finance. Small states often see the future before large ones admit it has arrived. That is why this story is not peripheral. It is a signal. And if you understand power, you understand why so many people are desperate to contain it. What the resolution really means. To understand what this resolution really means, we have to strip away the polite diplomatic language and look at the mechanism underneath it. This is not just another UN text filled with noble phrases that world leaders can applaud and ignore. This resolution is part of a much larger struggle over whether climate damage will remain politically acknowledged but economically unpriced, or whether it will begin to enter the realm that powerful governments fear most: law, obligation, and future liability. That distinction matters. For years, climate politics has been built around promises, targets, and voluntary frameworks. Governments made speeches. Corporations issued glossy reports. Summits produced declarations. But the structure of the problem barely changed, because the most important question was kept at arm's length: what happens when a country fails to act, and other countries suffer measurable harm as a result? That is the question sitting quietly inside this resolution. And once that question enters the legal bloodstream of the international system, the stakes change immediately. The link to the International Court of Justice is what gives this effort real weight. The court's advisory opinion opened a door that major emitters would have preferred to keep shut. It strengthened the argument that states do not merely have political preferences on climate. They have obligations under international law. That is a fundamental shift in framing. The old model treated climate action as a matter of goodwill, domestic politics, and negotiated convenience. The emerging model treats it as a matter of duty. And duty, once established, creates a chain reaction. It can be cited. It can be interpreted. It can be expanded. It can be used to anchor future claims in courts, institutions, and negotiations around the world. That is why the original draft mattered so much. It was not only about endorsing a legal opinion. It was about building operational meaning around that opinion. The stronger language on implementation signaled that states should not be allowed to hide behind symbolic compliance. The proposed registry for loss and damage would have done something even more powerful. It would have started organizing evidence. And evidence is where moral pain becomes political leverage. Once nations begin systematically documenting destroyed infrastructure, lost agricultural output, repeated storm damage, displaced communities, public health strain, and long-term fiscal losses, the debate becomes harder to contain. At that point, climate harm is no longer just tragic. It becomes legible, comparable, and potentially claimable. That is why the fight over wording was so fierce. Powerful governments know that law does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates through documents, precedents, and institutions that seem modest when they first appear. A non-binding resolution can still shape the legal atmosphere. It can guide later arguments. It can influence judges, negotiators, academics, civil society groups, insurers, lenders, and even finance ministries. In politics, language is never just language when it starts defining who owes what to whom. Even in weakened form, the revised resolution still matters because it preserves the core direction of travel. It still reinforces the principle that states must comply with their obligations under international law as they relate to climate change. It still affirms the need to hold temperature rise to 1.5 C. And it still points toward a rapid, just, and quantified phase-out of fossil fuel production and use. Those words matter because each one closes an escape route. Rapid challenges delay. Just challenges the idea that vulnerable countries should carry the adjustment burden alone. Quantified challenges the culture of vague commitments without measurable consequence. So the real meaning of this resolution is not that it solves the climate crisis. It does not. Its real meaning is that it helps move the crisis from the soft language of aspiration into the harder architecture of accountability. That is the threshold this battle is really about. And once the world crosses that threshold, even slowly, the politics of climate can never go back to what it was. Why Trump moved against it. To understand why Donald Trump moved against this resolution, you have to look past the public language and examine the structure of interest underneath it. This was never just about one draft at the United Nations. It was about preventing a dangerous shift in the rules of the game. Trump understood that if climate damage starts moving from the realm of activism into the realm of legal obligation, then the entire balance between industrial power and international accountability begins to change. That is the real threat he was responding to. For Trump, climate policy has never been primarily about science. It has always been about control. Control over energy. Control over regulation. Control over the cost structure facing American industry. And above all, control over whether the United States can be pressured by outside institutions into accepting limits, liabilities, or obligations it did not choose for itself. That is why even a non-binding resolution can trigger a fierce response. Because in politics, the most dangerous documents are often the ones that do not look dangerous yet. The Trump administration saw Vanuatu's push not as a moral appeal from a vulnerable country, but as an opening move in a much larger campaign. Once a principle is recognized at the international level, it begins to spread through systems. Lawyers cite it. Diplomats build on it. Courts absorb it. Activists weaponize it. Investors watch it. Insurers model around it. That is how soft language hardens into operating pressure. Trump's team knew that if the International Court of Justice advisory opinion started gaining institutional backing through the UN, it could eventually support claims that major emitters had not only contributed to the climate crisis, but had failed to meet duties under international law. From that point on, the issue would no longer be framed as policy disagreement. It would become a fight over exposure. And exposure is exactly what Trump was trying to block. Exposure for the fossil fuel sector. Exposure for U.S. industry. Exposure for a broader economic model that has depended for generations on cheap energy without fully pricing the downstream destruction. This is the deeper logic behind the administration's language about protecting American industry. What sounds like economic patriotism on the surface is, at a deeper level, a defense of a system that has long treated environmental damage as somebody else's burden. There is also a clear political instinct at work. Trump's worldview is built around the idea that multilateral institutions are not neutral forums, but arenas where American power is diluted and redistributed. He does not see international law as a stabilizing framework. He sees it as a potential constraint. And when that constraint threatens sectors tied to jobs, capital, and energy nationalism, his reaction is predictable: attack early, attack hard, and deny the principle before it becomes precedent. That is why Vanuatu was pressured to withdraw the resolution. Not simply to edit a few lines, but to stop the process before it gained legitimacy. Because once the process continues, even in weakened form, it sends a dangerous signal to the rest of the world. The biggest powers can be challenged, and the legal shield around historical emissions is no longer untouchable. So Trump moved against this resolution for one reason above all. He recognized that climate accountability is not just an environmental idea. It is a redistribution of power. And for leaders who built their politics on protecting entrenched power, that is always where the real fight begins. Fossil fuel power versus climate survival. At the heart of this battle is a brutal truth the modern world has spent decades trying to soften with elegant language. Fossil fuel power and climate survival are no longer moving in the same direction. One side is built to preserve wealth, scale, and political leverage in the present. The other is about protecting social stability, economic continuity, and human security over time. And the deeper this crisis goes, the clearer it becomes that the old energy order has survived not because it is honest, efficient, or sustainable, but because it has been politically protected by those who profited most from keeping its real costs hidden. This is where economics matters. For generations, fossil fuel systems delivered extraordinary gains. They powered industrial growth, military strength, transportation, manufacturing, and mass consumption. They helped build the modern American century. But they also relied on a trick that sits at the center of this story. The system privatized the gains while socializing the losses. Oil, gas, and coal generated profits for firms, tax revenue for states, and cheap energy for consumers, while the deeper damage was pushed outward onto the atmosphere, onto vulnerable countries, onto public health systems, onto disaster budgets, and onto future generations. That was never a free market. That was a market whose accounting was incomplete by design. In economic terms, climate change is the largest negative externality in modern history. But that phrase, while technically correct, is almost too mild for what it describes. What it really means is that one part of the world could grow rich while another part of the world absorbed the blowback. It means the price of energy never fully included the price of drowned coastlines, destroyed crops, collapsing fisheries, forced migration, repeated reconstruction, or long-term sovereign stress. It means that what looked efficient on a balance sheet was often wildly destructive in the real world. That is why Vanuatu's position matters so much. It is not merely making a moral case. It is exposing a structural fraud inside the global economy. When a country contributes almost nothing to the accumulation of climate risk but suffers some of the harshest consequences, the system is not just unequal. It is distorted. And when the countries most responsible continue fighting accountability while the most vulnerable are told to adapt, diversify, or be patient, what we are looking at is not neutral economics. It is a hierarchy of power dressed up as inevitability. The damage is not theoretical. Climate stress works through every major system that supports economic life. It destroys physical infrastructure. It raises insurance costs. It disrupts agriculture and food supply. It weakens labor productivity through heat. It strains hospitals, public finance, and emergency response capacity. It lowers tourism revenue, pressures currencies, worsens debt burdens, and reduces the planning horizon of governments forced to live in permanent recovery mode. A cyclone is not just a storm. It is a fiscal shock, a development shock, and a credibility shock for the state trying to hold society together afterward. That is the point many political leaders still refuse to confront. Fossil fuel dependence does not just create emissions. It creates systemic fragility. And the longer powerful states delay meaningful correction, the more expensive the adjustment becomes. In that sense, the conflict is no longer between economic growth and environmental concern. It is between one model of growth that extracts now and destabilizes later, and another model that tries to keep societies governable in the decades ahead. So when we talk about fossil fuel power versus climate survival, we are really talking about a struggle over what kind of economy counts as rational. One rationality says protect current capital, current incumbents, and current geopolitical advantage for as long as possible. The other says an economy that destroys the conditions of long-term stability is not strong, no matter how profitable it looks in the quarter. That is the line Vanuatu is forcing into view. And once that line is visible, the moral question becomes unavoidable, but so does the financial one. How long can the world keep defending an energy order whose hidden costs are no longer staying hidden? Why Vanuatu matters far beyond the Pacific. What makes Vanuatu so important is not its size, its military weight, or its position in the usual hierarchy of power. What makes Vanuatu important is that it stands where the global system becomes honest. It is one of those places where climate change can no longer be hidden behind polite delay, statistical abstraction, or political theater. In countries like Vanuatu, the crisis is stripped of its disguises. It shows up as physical damage, fiscal pressure, disrupted livelihoods, and national vulnerability in its rawest form. That is why what happens there matters far beyond the Pacific. It is not a side story from the margins. It is a warning from the front edge of the future. Large countries often make the mistake of thinking that small island states are morally compelling but strategically secondary. That is a profound misunderstanding of how systemic risk works in the 21st century. The countries that sit closest to the climate fault line are often the first to reveal what the rest of the world will eventually face in slower, more distributed form. Vanuatu is not just experiencing weather instability. It is experiencing what happens when climate pressure begins to penetrate the foundations of an economy, the capacity of a government, and the confidence of a society. Once you understand that, Vanuatu stops looking small. It starts looking early. This matters directly to the United States, even if many Americans do not yet see the connection. Climate stress does not stay neatly contained inside one coastline or one region. It travels through systems. It moves through insurance markets, where repeated losses force prices higher and coverage lower. It moves through commodity chains, when extreme weather affects supply, transport, or production. It moves through public finance, when governments face higher disaster recovery costs and lower fiscal flexibility. It moves through migration, when damaged livelihoods push people across borders or into already strained urban systems. And it moves through politics, because once citizens lose confidence that institutions can protect them from repeated shocks, the ground under democratic stability begins to weaken. That is why Vanuatu's message should land hard in America. The country is not speaking from theory. It is speaking from lived exposure. When a tropical cyclone can tear through a national economy with enormous force, the lesson is not simply that island states are vulnerable. The lesson is that climate disruption behaves like a multiplier. It magnifies pre-existing weaknesses, accelerates debt stress, weakens development gains, and shortens the planning horizon of the state itself. The same logic applies everywhere, including in far larger and richer countries. Wealth can delay the shock. It cannot repeal the mechanism. There is also a political lesson in Vanuatu's role. Small states are often dismissed because they cannot coerce. But in moments like this, coercion is not the only form of influence that matters. Vanuatu has something many larger powers lack: clarity. It can say openly that this crisis is about survival, responsibility, and unequal burden. It can cut through the evasive language that dominant economies often use when they want to preserve comfort without paying the full cost. That kind of clarity is dangerous to entrenched interests precisely because it is hard to discredit. It comes from exposure, not ideology. So Vanuatu matters far beyond the Pacific because it is functioning as an early warning system, a legal catalyst, and a moral test all at once. It is forcing larger countries, including the United States, to confront a truth they would rather postpone. The age of climate damage is no longer approaching. It is already redistributing cost, risk, and power across the world. And the nations that feel it first are often the ones that understand it most clearly. The battle inside the UN: compromise, pressure, and power. What happens inside the United Nations is often presented to the public as diplomacy in its most civilized form: patient negotiation, careful wording, shared principles, and procedural fairness. But when the stakes are real, the UN is not a sanctuary from power. It is one of the places where power does its quietest and most consequential work. That is exactly what this fight over Vanuatu's climate resolution reveals. Beneath the polished language, this was a struggle over who gets to define responsibility, who gets to narrow the scope of accountability, and who gets to decide whether international law remains strong enough to touch the interests of major emitting states. The first thing to understand is that powerful governments rarely need to kill an initiative outright if they can weaken it early enough. In fact, dilution is often more effective than open defeat. A proposal that dies in public can generate sympathy, media attention, and political backlash. A proposal that survives in weakened form may look intact from a distance while losing the very mechanisms that would have made it dangerous. That is how institutional power often operates. It edits before it confronts. It trims before it rejects. It pressures language, not just outcomes. And in climate politics, language is never a side issue, because language is where obligation either begins to harden or is deliberately kept soft. That is why the pressure campaign around this resolution matters so much. The Trump administration understood that the most sensitive parts of the draft were not the general moral statements. The real danger lay in the elements that could create continuity between climate harm, legal recognition, and future claims. This is where the proposed registry for loss and damage became such a critical fault line. A registry may sound technical, even bureaucratic, but bureaucratic instruments are often where power begins to shift. They organize evidence. They standardize harm. They create comparability across cases. And once harm becomes organized, the politics of denial become much harder to sustain. That is why pushing to remove such a mechanism was not a minor edit. It was a strategic move to prevent the architecture of accountability from becoming more concrete. Vanuatu, led in this effort by Ralph Regan Vanu, had to operate inside that pressure without losing the larger purpose. This is where small state diplomacy becomes far more sophisticated than most people realize. Countries like Vanuatu do not walk into the UN with illusions about fairness. They walk in knowing the room is tilted. They know the largest economies can mobilize diplomatic networks, economic influence, and political fear faster than smaller states can mobilize moral urgency. So survival inside that arena depends on judgment. Push too hard on every line, and the coalition fractures. Surrender too much, and the principle collapses. What Vanuatu chose was the difficult middle path, absorb tactical losses in order to preserve strategic direction. That is not weakness. That is institutional realism. It reflects an understanding that in multilateral politics, the goal is not always to win cleanly. The goal is often to leave enough of the core idea standing that it can be built on later. This is how norms advance when the strongest players are hostile. They move through partial victories, delayed consequences, and fragments of language that seem modest in the moment but prove durable over time. The revised resolution may be less ambitious than it was, but it still carries the central message that states have obligations under international law in relation to climate change. And once that message survives coordinated pressure from powers determined to contain it, it becomes harder to dismiss as fringe rhetoric. The role of other states in this process also tells us something important about the real condition of multilateralism. Vanuatu was backed by countries including the Netherlands, Colombia, Barbados, Kenya, Jamaica, and the Philippines. Yet Ralph Region Vanu made clear that opposition often proved more effective than support, and that the European Union had not been as helpful as expected. That is a familiar pattern in global governance. Many governments are comfortable endorsing ambition in principle, but become far less useful when ambition starts threatening sectors tied to trade, energy, liability, or domestic political comfort. This is why the crisis of multilateralism is not only about bad actors blocking progress. It is also about hesitant actors failing to defend it with equal force. The presence of opposition from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia makes the broader structure impossible to ignore. These are not identical powers with identical systems, but on this question they shared a common interest: prevent climate law from advancing to the point where it can discipline carbon-heavy political economies. That convergence matters. It shows that climate diplomacy is not simply a debate over science or values. It is a direct contest over development models, legal exposure, and the future distribution of economic risk. Once you see that, the UN does not look like a venue for abstract negotiation. It looks like what it really is: a battleground where the old energy order fights to preserve room for delay, and vulnerable states fight to narrow that room before the damage becomes even more irreversible. For American viewers, that should be sobering. The failure of climate diplomacy is often explained as a problem of complexity, disagreement, or insufficient coordination. Those factors are real, but they do not go far enough. What this episode shows is that the system is also designed to protect incumbents. It gives powerful states multiple ways to slow change without appearing openly obstructionist. It allows them to hollow out proposals while still speaking the language of engagement. That is not a bug in the system. In many ways, it is the system. And yet this is not a story of total defeat. The fact that Vanuatu kept the resolution alive at all matters. It shows that even under pressure, even after compromise, a determined state can still force movement inside institutions built to absorb and dilute pressure from below. That is the deeper lesson from this battle. The UN is not above power, but it is not fully captive to power either. It remains one of the few places where small states, if they are disciplined enough, can still force the world to put uncomfortable truths on the record. Once those truths are on the record, history has a way of returning to them. Law, liability, and the future of climate accountability. The next phase of this fight is not really about speeches. It is about whether climate harm can be translated into legal consequence, and once that translation begins, whether the world is prepared for what follows. That is the deeper meaning of law, liability, and climate accountability. For decades, the climate crisis was treated politically as a problem of negotiation and economically as a problem of transition. But now a more disruptive question is entering the system: what happens when countries, industries, and institutions that help drive the damage are no longer judged only by what they promised to do next, but by what they failed to do when the warning signs were already clear? That question is explosive because law changes the structure of risk. Politics can delay, reframe, and soften. Law records, interprets, and accumulates. Once a principle enters legal circulation, it does not remain trapped inside one courtroom or one UN chamber. It starts moving through institutions, Judges cite it. Advocates build around it. Regulators borrow its logic. Investors read the direction of travel. Insurers recalculate exposure. Governments begin preparing for scenarios they publicly dismiss. That is why the fight over legal framing matters so much. It is never just about the words on the page. It is about the operating future those words might begin to create. This is exactly where climate accountability is heading. The old era was built on voluntary action, soft targets, and political ambiguity. The emerging era is increasingly shaped by attribution, evidence, and claims of responsibility. That shift may be uneven and contested, but it is already underway. The critical concept here is not simply emissions. It is loss connected to emissions, damage connected to delay, and obligation connected to power. Once those links become credible in law, the logic of impunity begins to weaken. That is why the idea of loss and damage has become so politically dangerous to major emitters. It changes the emotional grammar of the debate. It moves the discussion away from abstract global concern and toward measurable injury. A flooded road, a collapsed fishery, a destroyed crop cycle, a ruined school system, a repeated disaster recovery burden, a shrinking tax base, a debt spiral after climate shocks. These are no longer framed only as unfortunate byproducts of modernity. They begin to look like harms within a system where some actors took the gains while others absorbed the fallout. That is a very different moral and legal landscape. The United States understands this better than it admits. That is why it resists so early and so aggressively. It is not because every future claim is guaranteed to succeed. Many will not. It is because once accountability enters the field, everything downstream becomes harder to control. Courts can become less predictable. Public expectations shift. Domestic litigation gains energy. Corporate disclosure becomes more politically sensitive. Lending practices can change. Insurance markets can tighten around exposed assets. Even if no single case rewrites the global order, the accumulation of pressure can still alter behavior in powerful ways. There is a deeper theory of change at work here, and it matters. In political economy, systems often resist reform until the cost of denial begins showing up in multiple domains at once. That is exactly what climate accountability threatens to do. It can force carbon-intensive systems to confront legal pressure, financial repricing, reputational erosion, and institutional scrutiny at the same time. That convergence is what powerful actors fear. Not one lawsuit. Not one advisory opinion. Not one UN vote. The fear is that these pieces, taken together, begin to form a structure that is harder to outrun. This is also why the future of climate accountability will not be linear. It will move by surge and setback. Some governments will resist. Some courts will hesitate. Some institutions will dilute language or avoid strong enforcement. But history shows that once a field of harm develops a legal vocabulary, it rarely disappears. It matures. Human rights matured that way. Corporate liability matured that way. Environmental regulation matured that way. First, the claims seem too ambitious. Then, over time, they become normal. For American viewers, the strategic implication is simple and urgent. The question is no longer whether climate accountability will remain a fringe idea. The question is how fast it will move from diplomatic argument into the machinery of finance, law, and governance. And when it does, the consequences will not be limited to foreign governments or distant island states. They will touch domestic policy, federal spending, corporate strategy, insurance systems, infrastructure planning, and the political legitimacy of leaders who insisted for too long that delay carried no serious price. So when Vanuatu pushes this agenda forward, even against resistance, it is helping define the legal architecture of the next era. It is helping build the memory of who knew, who resisted, who paid, and who kept trying to push the bill onto someone else. That memory matters because law is not just a tool of punishment. It is a tool of historical clarification. And in a crisis this large, clarification is the first step toward consequence. What this reveals about Trump's worldview. What this fight reveals about Donald Trump's worldview is not merely that he dislikes climate agreements or distrusts international institutions. It reveals something more fundamental and more consequential. He sees the world as a hierarchy of force, not a framework of shared obligation. In that worldview, rules are useful when they reinforce national leverage, but suspect when they distribute responsibility upward toward powerful states. That is the core logic at work here. The clash over Vanuatu's resolution is not an exception to Trump's governing philosophy. It is one of its clearest expressions. Trump's political instinct has always been to treat constraints as weakness unless they can be weaponized against someone else. That applies to trade, alliances, law, regulation, migration, and now climate. He does not approach international systems as fragile structures that require maintenance in order to preserve long-term stability. He approaches them as arenas where winners protect room to maneuver and losers are expected to adjust. Once you understand that, his opposition to climate accountability stops looking tactical and starts looking entirely consistent. A legal framework that says major powers owe duties to weaker countries is, in Trump's terms, not order. It is a threat to dominance. That helps explain why his rhetoric around energy is so emotionally charged. Fossil fuels are not simply an input in his political economy. They are a symbol of unconstrained national strength. They represent abundance without apology, extraction without guilt, growth without negotiation. The appeal of this message inside the United States is obvious. It speaks to workers anxious about decline, consumers worried about prices, and voters who hear the language of climate diplomacy as code for sacrifice imposed by distant institutions. Trump turns that anxiety into a story of defiance. He tells Americans they are being targeted by elites, constrained by bureaucrats, and weakened by global frameworks that do not respect their interests. It is a potent message because it contains a partial truth. International systems are often uneven, selective, and politically manipulated. But Trump uses that truth not to reform the system into something fairer. He uses it to justify pulling away from responsibility altogether. This is where the deeper contradiction appears. Trump presents his approach as realism, but much of it is actually denial protected by force. Realism would mean recognizing that climate risk is now embedded in insurance markets, infrastructure planning, sovereign exposure, food systems, migration patterns, and national security itself. Realism would mean understanding that a country cannot remain economically strong if it refuses to price rising systemic risk honestly. Realism would mean preparing the United States for the world that is arriving, not preserving the illusion that old models can hold indefinitely if Washington just pushes back hard enough. What Trump offers instead is a politics of delayed reckoning. It protects incumbents in the present by increasing instability in the future. There is also a moral architecture beneath this worldview, and it deserves to be named clearly. Trump's model assumes that the burden of adjustment should fall downward. The weak adapt. The exposed absorb. The powerful reserve options. That is why a country like Vanuatu becomes so inconvenient. It is not just requesting sympathy. It is challenging the direction of burden itself. It is saying that vulnerability should not automatically mean silence, and that power should not automatically mean exemption. For a worldview built on preserving asymmetry, that is deeply disruptive. The most revealing part is that Trump likely sees this stance as a defense of American freedom. And in a narrow political sense, many supporters see it that way too. They hear climate accountability and think of lost jobs, higher bills, foreign pressure, and endless legal entanglement. But that framing leaves out the costs already building inside the American system. Refusing accountability does not protect ordinary Americans from climate disruption. It simply changes how and when they pay. They pay through rising insurance costs, through weakened infrastructure, through emergency spending, through greater market volatility, and through a slower, harsher adjustment when the old protections finally fail. So what this reveals about Trump's worldview is not just opposition to one resolution or one institution. It reveals a larger theory of order. Power should remain as unbound as possible at the top, while consequence should remain as diffuse as possible below. That theory can be politically effective for a time. It can even look strong. But over time it corrodes the very stability it claims to protect, because systems built on evasion eventually collide with reality. And reality, unlike diplomacy, does not negotiate forever. The real meaning of Vanuatu's stand. The real meaning of Vanuatu's stand is not that a small country found the courage to speak. It is that a small country decided speaking was no longer enough. That is the line history is crossing here. For years, climate-vulnerable nations were expected to perform a familiar role in global politics, provide the moral testimony, describe the suffering, attend the summits, and then step aside while larger powers negotiated the limits of their own inconvenience. Vanuatu is rejecting that script. It is moving from witness to actor, from warning to pressure, from symbolic presence to legal and political intervention. And that shift matters far beyond one vote at the United Nations. What Vanuatu is really doing is exposing the central weakness of the current global order. The system is very good at acknowledging pain. It is very bad at redistributing responsibility. It can produce sympathy more easily than consequence. It can host speeches more easily than enforcement. It can praise vulnerable nations while still protecting the economic structures that keep those nations vulnerable. That is why this moment feels so important. Vanuatu is not asking the world to feel more. It is asking the world to account more. And once that demand is made clearly, the gap between moral language and material behavior becomes impossible to ignore. That is also why the response from Donald Trump and other major powers matters so much. Their resistance reveals that the conflict is no longer about whether climate change is real, or whether island states are suffering, or whether the international community should care in principle. The conflict is now about whether concern will ever be allowed to harden into duty. That is a far more dangerous question for entrenched power, because duty can be argued, measured, cited, and eventually enforced. It can shape institutions. It can influence markets. It can outlast administrations. Vanuatu understands that. That is why it pushed forward even after the text was weakened. The country is fighting not only for this resolution, but for the direction of the law that may follow. There is a deeper strategic lesson here. Small states are often underestimated because people confuse power with size. But history shows that smaller nations can become decisive when they articulate truths that larger powers are too invested to admit. That is how change often begins in international politics. Not with the generosity of the strong, but with the persistence of those who have the least room left for illusion. Vanuatu belongs to that tradition. It is forcing the world to confront a basic question: if the countries that contributed least to this crisis are expected to bear the harshest consequences, then what exactly is the moral and legal meaning of world order? For the United States, that question should land with particular force. Americans are used to thinking of global instability as something that happens elsewhere first. But the deeper logic of this story is that climate damage is already reorganizing the distribution of risk, cost, and legitimacy across the world. It is changing what counts as security. It is changing what counts as economic prudence. It is changing what future generations will demand from law and government. Vanuatu is not outside that story. It is simply earlier inside it. And that is the real meaning of this stand. Vanuatu is telling the world that the age of climate impunity cannot last forever, because the human and economic damage is becoming too visible, too measurable, and too destructive to keep burying under procedure and delay. It is saying that when power refuses responsibility, law must begin to close the distance. It is saying that the most vulnerable countries are no longer content to be treated as evidence of tragedy while the authors of the system remain protected from consequence. In the end, Vanuatu's stand is not powerful because it guarantees immediate victory. It is powerful because it changes the terms of the fight. It puts accountability on the table and a system built to avoid it. It forces the strongest countries to reveal what they are defending. And it reminds the world that history does not always move when the powerful decide it is time. Sometimes it moves because those living closest to the edge refuse to wait any longer. What makes this story so powerful is that it is not really about one vote, one document, or even one country. It is about a turning point in how the world understands responsibility. Vanuatu, a small Pacific island nation with very little traditional power, chose not to remain a symbol of climate suffering. It chose to become an active force inside the international system. And in doing so, it exposed something bigger than itself: the gap between what powerful nations say about climate change and what they are actually willing to do when accountability becomes real. Donald Trump's opposition revealed that this was never just a debate about wording at the United Nations. It was a battle over whether climate harm would remain politically acknowledged but economically and legally protected from consequence. Vanuatu moved forward anyway. That matters. It shows that even in a world shaped by money, military power, and fossil fuel interests, smaller nations can still force the truth into the center of the conversation. They can still challenge delay. They can still make power show its face. The deeper lesson is this: size does not define influence nearly as much as clarity, courage, and persistence do. In life, many people think they must be the biggest, richest, or most powerful person in the room before they can make a difference. That is not true. Real change often begins when someone decides to speak clearly about a problem others are too comfortable to confront. The way to apply this in everyday life is simple, but not easy. Stop waiting for perfect conditions before taking a stand. Be honest about what is broken. Learn how systems work. Understand where power hides. And then act with discipline, not just emotion. Whether in work, family, community, or public life, the people who matter most are often the ones who refuse to let pressure, fear, or convenience silence what they know is true. Now here is a quick question for you. Who showed the greater strength in this story? A. Donald Trump, by using power to block risk to U.S. industry. B. Vanuatu, by pushing accountability forward despite pressure. Comment A or B below. And what do you think about this story overall? Do you believe small nations can truly reshape global politics? Or do major powers still control the final outcome no matter what? Share your view in the comments so everyone can learn from your perspective. And subscribe to the channel to support our work and help keep these deep, honest stories coming.